Hello, everybody. We are back to that old question that we keep on bumping back into about artificial intelligence. Can it think? Can it replicate human creativity? My guest today, Laurent Dubreuil. I hope I haven't mispronounced his name. Maybe we need an AI bot to do that. Is a professor of French literature and many other things, actually, at Cornell University. He is also involved with the humanities lab there, which is focusing, I think, on the relationship between technology and creativity in the arts. He's also the author of a cover story for Harper's, Metal Machine Music. Can AI think creatively? Can we? Laurent is joining us. So, Laurent, I assume you're around the university. Where are you talking to me from?
Yes, I'm in my office today. Yes.
I often ask Laurent, when we have these AI questions in creativity with supposed humans, for them to prove that they're people as opposed to bots. How would you prove that you are a real person? I mean, a real person, of course, in inverted commas, as opposed to the creation of a smart machine. How would you convince me that you're a human being?
That's an interesting one. So what we tried to do in the experiment, that was the main point in the article I wrote for Harper's. What we tried to do was to ask a machine to write poems and ask humans to write poems. But in fact, what happens all the time is that when we divide the question between human versus machine as a sort of either or question, I believe we are slightly misguided, in the sense that humans are quite mechanical in many aspects of their lives, and so the question is becoming slightly different. One is, could we really prove that I'm not an AI generated creature? And the other one is, are we completely sure that the people we interact with are humans to the full extent of the term? That we are not interacting with robotic versions of ourselves, although they could be in flesh and blood. So the question is not exactly an either or, I believe. How could I convince you? I mean, we live on two different screens, so it's already, it's a very old question, already the question that Descartes is asking in the 17th century, when he's wondering if the people he see down the streets are not in fact mechanical robots. He's not using robots, but that's the same term, that would be automata that would just advance. And so for Descartes, God had to be the only explanation for life. I mean, many centuries later, other philosophers thought that there was a sort of inner feeling of inner conviction in us that the reality is what it is, and that the other humans are actual humans and not only figments of our imagination. Now we have a different version of the same system with the I saw that very recently a beauty contest, an AI beauty contest, was entered, and so we had a decision made on AI beauty. If everything I'm saying today is exactly as expected, completely normal, that doesn't necessarily prove that I'm a machine. But one point I'm trying to make is that as humans, we are sometimes able to do something that is beyond the norm, and that we could be on the exceptional side of things. And that machines, as we know them today, are really unable to reach that level.
In other words, humans are capable of surprise, and machines aren't.
Or meaningful surprise, maybe.
Meaningful surprise. I mean, in your piece, which is a really good piece, you quote the inventor of artificial intelligence, or certainly of computer software, Ada Lovelace, who oddly enough, was Byron's niece, or no, Byron's daughter. Um, she talked famously about AI or software not being able to originate anything. Do you agree with Ada Lovelace?
With the given the machines she was speaking about, yes.
And that
Uh,
was, of course, Babbage's machine,
yeah.
his the first computer really of the middle of the 19th century. I mean, arguably the first mechanical computer, certainly electrically driven computer.
So certainly for the machine she was describing, uh, for GPT or large language models as we know them today, it's an open question. I believe I would tend to be closer to Lady Lovelace in this respect. What is interesting in the quote you were showing on screen is that Alan Turing, in the late 40s, early 50s, is taking that reflection, which, in my opinion, is not a very polemical reflection from Lady Lovelace at all. And he's turning it into what he calls Lady Lovelace's objection. And in fact, she was not objecting, she was just specifying the limits of the system. And from that point on, we have a sort of rewriting of a relatively descriptive statement that is being presented as an objection to AI, and would be strange for Lovelace to be an objector to AI, since she is a pioneer in the reflection on the topic of computers, proto computers, and then because it's becoming an objection, it is embedded by Turing in one of his articles, and then by a certain legacy of his, it is embedded in a sort of mission to rescue any kind of bad reputation that AI could have vis-a-vis originality. And one of Turing's ways of answering without giving a response to the question that is raised by Ada Lovelace's statement is to say, are we even sure that we originate anything? And there is this tendency that we completely see today to cover up some of the limitations in terms of inventivity in the broad sense that we see in computers, to cover up those limitations by saying, but in the end of the day, we as humans, are we anyway better? And the answer I would like to enter is that we as humans could be better, or we could be just as repetitive and mediocre as our systems are, if we prefer going that way, which might be a sort of a social proposition that is made to us for quite some time now.
Yeah, it's. I've often thought that it may be more than coincidental that we have AI at a time where there doesn't seem to be much original going on. And I live out on the West Coast. When you talk to software people, they're very hard to distinguish from machines. They talk like them, they think like them. Going back to the Lovelace question on origination, is this an important question? Because of course, Laurent, if if uh, if computers or if software can think for itself, then it opens up a lot of metaphysical potential that your friend Descartes, who you began with, would even be surprised with. The idea of there being some sort of autonomous machine that can originate things as opposed to humans, even if we invented them in the first place. Maybe we don't even invent them. I mean, that's another issue.
It's an important question. I mean, for what Lovelace is describing, and in a sense, it's close to the situation we are facing now with the large generative system that are being trained on data. So when she was saying that it has no pretension to originate anything, it she meant that the machine was reshuffling or rearranging or recombining the data it had been fed. Today, with the self-learning algorithms that we have, the situation is a bit different, in the sense that we are not exactly feeding instructions the systems are supposedly learning, if we want to use that term, learning by themselves. If we want to use by themselves, I mean, in both cases, we are reaching a high level of metaphorical style, but let's admit that we have something we could call self-learning. The question is that the training set, which is human through and through so far, that could change, that is probably changing in right now, but the humanly generated or human generated, that huge data set, huge training set, is the basis for an exploration by the machine of what is the most probable continuation of any token, a token being a bit less than a word in many cases. So what GPT or other systems of that kind will produce is a sort of retro projection, uh, digging into the frequencies from the past and trying to come up with something else. So then we are back to the question of what it means to be original or what it means to be creative and so on. We could have discussions about the the very terms. If to originate or to be original means coming up with something that has never been said or never been made, it's a high bar. So I don't use originate so much in the. I believe I only use it in the piece when we have the quotes, but I'm more about the unfolding of the words that could relate to inventivity, innovation, generation, creation.
And Laurent, is it coincidental? It's got to be more than coincidental that also we live in an age where we fetishize originality. There are some civilizations, maybe even existing today, where the idea of originality is looked down on.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, that's originality is very much a romantic term, so that it makes perfect sense that Lovelace would use it. The idea that genius, since it's another romantic concept, or creation or poetry would reveal the originality and the belief that the individual could, to some extent, dig into oneself to find the pure origin of what it is, and that this thing would be in itself interesting enough. All of this is quite embedded in a certain moment of time. So it's a certain period of time, a certain civilization, and so on. However, even in societies where culture is tied more closely to
Tradition.
a notion of tradition or a notion of continuation, creation could exist. So it's also why there is a difference between creation and being original. Especially in the 20th century, and especially in the US, we have seen these uh, the afterlife of the romantic concept of originality becoming a sort of it's direct expression of the self, be yourself, be authentic, and so on. And that clearly put us in a situation where the expression of the self is in fact a sort of rendition of predetermined identities. So the very terms we use could backfire and could lead us to somewhere else. As for creation, same thing. It could be said to be a mystical term, but let's keep it because poetry, for instance, derives from the Greek, which means fabrication, construction, and creation, poiesis. And so I believe there is a value in saying that creation is something distinct, but I'm not saying that we are creative nonstop or that we could be creative nonstop.
Or
What
we would want to be. So again, coming back to Ada Lovelace, because she seems so important here. Could one argue, Laurent, conceivably in historical terms, that software itself, I'm quoting you here, is a feature of the afterlife of Romanticism? And that this whole supposed computer revolution is a return to the romanticism of the 19th century, of Byron, of Lady Lovelace and their circle?
Maybe not necessarily, but first first part of the answer to your provocative question is that in fact each time we speak about the technical aspects of things today, about computers, about the digital world and so on, we are truly relating to relatively recent technical inventions and so on. True, but the underlying theories are very old. I mean, they are usually predating Romanticism as well.
Yeah.
And so it's not as if we were facing a completely new set of questions. And in fact, is poetry creative or not is not exactly the latest debate. It's already a question in the first, I mean, in the European corpus, Aristotle's book entitled Poetics is already making a difference between people writing in poetic meters, in poetic lines, and people writing poetry. So there is already a distinction that is made very early on uh, between the application of a rule that could describe a literary genre and something else. And so many of the questions we are tackling today, and that's one of the reasons why I've been involved in several experiments as a scholar. Many of the questions we are tackling today with new techniques, with new questions, with new methods, with new tools, are driving us back to very fundamental questions, which is
Yeah, I
why
mean, you began this conversation with a reference to Descartes and his original Cartesian question, the foundations of modern philosophy. Does AI and the computer, is that just another chapter in the Cartesian narrative, or is it part of a new book, a new kind of study?
it's there is a very strong Cartesian legacy. There is no doubt about it, um, including the mathematical interest that you see in Descartes, since he was a very famous mathematician as well. Um, at the same time, we are dealing with different things, of course. But to just quote someone I'm mentioning in the piece, and who disagrees with the current powers of AI, Noam Chomsky, whose work was instrumental in the birth of cognitive studies, he believes he is a Cartesian through and through. He said that many times. So you have deeply unfolded in the so-called cognitive or computer revolution. You have a very strong metaphysical core that is something we can debate technically, but we should also debate philosophically. And each time we take these technical products as something that would be separate from a larger context, we are making a mistake. The engineers, although they might not come with their own philosophical tools, are in fact operating within a certain set of parameters that have been predetermined very theoretically, usually.
Yeah, and when you talked about Lovelace and Romanticism, the other main figure in your book is Turing. You've already mentioned him. Turing, of course, has now become a heroic figure, symbolic figure, not just for scientists and AI researchers, but for gay rights activists. He had a tragic fate. You wrote an interesting piece also in Harper's a couple of years ago, Non-Conforming Against the Erosion of Academic Freedom by Identity Politics. Turing was around today. Maybe he would be involved with identity politics. He might also be a skeptic. Is there any, in your view, as thinking historically, again, is it perhaps coincidental that a figure like Turing, such an outcast, such a man persecuted by the conventional culture, should have been the most influential 20th century figure when it came to AI?
He became a very conventional figure as well. I mean that the
Well, he wanted to be conventional, but he
and
wasn't, right?
so
Or maybe he didn't. I don't want to speak on behalf. We did a
it's
show
difficult.
a couple of years ago with his biographer. He's a fascinating man.
He's a difficult character in many respects.
You mean that in a good or a bad way?
Uh, I mean, many things. He was really a very prominent scientist, very smart guy. Many of the things he says, 1947, 1950, about the when he's
Automated
doing his
computing
work
engine.
of
I know in your piece you're rather critical of that
yeah.
1947 lecture on automatic computing engine.
So I believe his whatever his opinion could be about that. You know that he was also apparently convinced that telepathy was a fact. So that's and he's putting it at one point maybe as a sort of ironical view that if telepathy exists, then everything he has described about the mind should be revisited. But in any case, what he's presenting in these sets of articles and interventions at the BBC and so on is basically the blueprint of a certain propaganda in favor of AI. And it's true that his transformation into a hero, also as a gay, as a bearer of the gay identity, is
As
part
someone
of,
who was persecuted by the state for that
yes,
sexual identity.
yes. But was he persecuted because of his identity, or was he persecuted? I mean, identity as such. I doubt it slightly, but he was.
Well,
He
he
was
had. I'm not clear what he had electric
yeah. No,
shock.
no. What I'm saying is that we use the term identity almost in every sentence today in the public arena. And I think we would be happier collectively if identity were to disappear as a term, which was part of what I was writing a few years ago for Harper's. And in fact, the question of identity was not the question that was animating the hatred and the state handled hatred against men having a relationship with men in the UK. So, but it's a complicated matter. If we don't believe if we believe we are dealing with identities, then everything is becoming much more set and much more rigidified, which is convenient for an era where everything is becoming more and more algorithmic.
Yeah, Laurent, I asked you when we started, I asked you the question, prove you're a computer, prove you're human. I'm not sure if it's possible to do, but you've certainly done it in the first 20 minutes. I think it'd be hard to listen to this conversation and conclude that either of us are algorithms or bots, certainly at the moment, maybe in 50 years. I want to remind everyone that we are speaking with a Cornell professor, Laurent Dubreuil, author of Metal Machine Music, Can AI Think Creatively? And perhaps even more interestingly, Can We? It's in a recent issue of Harper's. Alongside Harper's, which is considered perhaps the best magazine around today, the best quarterly, are our friends at Liberty, a quarterly journal of culture and politics, who are helping us bring very human, all too human guests like Laurent Dubreuil. Going to run a short feature on liberties, and then we'll be back with Laurent to talk more specifically about the experiment he did at Cornell, at his humanities lab, on poetry and AI. So don't go away, anyone. We'll be back with the real Laurent Dubreuil in a second.
The noise, there is nuance, insight. Liberties is not just a journal of ideas. It's a meteor of intelligent substance. It's the place to be for engaged citizens. Politics, opinion, substance. Liberties is a triumph for freedom of thought. A quarterly of urgency, of cultural exploration, of intellectual delight, of immaculate prose. It's invaluable. Subscribe now or find Liberties at your favorite bookseller.
And you can subscribe to Liberties at libertiesjournal.com. We're speaking with Laurent Dubreuil. Every time I say it, I think I do a worse job, Laurent, so I won't keep on trying to repeat your last name, but you are, to our listeners, Laurent. You did this experiment at Cornell. You run the humanities, I think you're the founder of the humanities lab at Cornell, which is a kind of multimedia, multidisciplinary group of people. You did this experiment with another professor at Cornell, Morten Christensen, who's in the psychology department. What were you up to? What were you trying to do?
So Morten and I work together as teachers. Every other year, we teach a graduate seminar, an undergraduate seminar on culture, cognition, the humanities, trying to represent some of the work that is ongoing, but on topics or questions that are typically attached to the idea of the humanities, but that are being done with more experimental or psychological methods. But we had never worked together on a research project. And when GPT-3 was released, so before GPT would become such a common name in
Yeah, that's ancient history. How long ago was that? 2 or 3 years ago?
A bit more than that. A bit more than that. So very beginning of GPT-3 being released, the
which
early
is, of course, an OpenAI product, which was the first OpenAI product, was it?
there were two. There was two before, but yeah, and one it's not very clear when it began. But 3 was supposed to be a groundbreaking thing, and in the community, there were a number of posts on the internet explaining that GPT-3 was so good it could even write poetry. I mean, you still have this idea that if it's very good, it will write some poetry. And Morten had the desire, proposed to me that we could apply for a grant together, since we both work on language in different ways as well. To work on poetry. I had written a few years ago a book entitled Poetry and Mind, which is trying to understand the question of creation and poetry within the mind across cultures and languages, with the question of poetry at its core. So it was logical for us to move into that direction. And we decided to apply for a grant that we got and to begin working with GPT-3. And from the beginning, our question was not the either or, machine versus the human, but we were trying to see if different kinds of human authors would generate different kinds of poems, and if the machine that we were just discovering would be able to be closer to a certain regime of writing.
I don't know, one of the poets that you picked on, perhaps is the best way of putting it, is Emily Dickinson. How does Dickinson fit into this experiment?
So to make a long story short, it's always a bit long when we run an experiment. We try to come up with a set of authors in English, because GPT-3 appeared to be much better in English than in other languages. The later versions are quite good in a few other languages, such as French, for instance. So, but we did a English-centered task, and so we selected a certain number of poets in the English language, be they American or British, and we asked both GPT and humans to add a few lines to 2 lines or 2 or 3 lines that we were proposing from each poet. And Emily Dickinson was on the database at the very beginning for us.
Is she any good in your view? Is she a good poet?
Yes, in my view, she's a good poet. Yeah. I mean, we tried to have different kinds of poets and different genres, but also as best as we could, we tried to have prominent and interesting and good poets. But it's just a small selection. I mean, you have to run it as an experiment. But for Dickinson, we had all kinds of issues with the very first GPT-3, because GPT-3 was, technically speaking, much poorer than in my wildest nightmares or dreams, in the sense that GPT-3 at the beginning was really unable to come up with rhymes, let alone metrical structures or things of that sort. But what was called Instruct, that is a more advanced version of GPT-3, became a bit better with some of those aspects. And so we could try to compare human generated with AI generated without obviously giving in advance.
I know it's a complicated thing, Laurent, but you basically generated AI generated poetry, and then, which wasn't real, of course, but sounded like Emily Dickinson, sounded as if she might create it. And then did you test that out on your students? Was that the goal of the experiment?
So the goal was to have three kinds of texts, basically. So you have the text written by the author.
Yeah.
You are suggesting two lines to a human participant or a machine participant, and asking the participant to continue the lines. So you end up with three different kinds of texts: the original ones, the ones that begin with Dickinson or Shakespeare or Byron, and that are continued by the system, and the ones that are continued by the regular undergraduate student who happen to be all undergraduate students at Cornell. So you end up with three different sets of texts, although the first lines are always coming from the published authors, and you can begin to compare them. You can, at least, which is what we have been doing so far, you can ask both humans and a mechanical system to determine if this has been written by.
And with this, do you think the experiment would have been different if you'd have been using GPT-4 or one of the later versions?
Not tremendously different. So it's a bit more subjective because we didn't run the experiment again, but for on my own, working with the computer with GPT-4, it wouldn't be. It would be different, but would it be better? I don't believe it would be better.
So what did you learn, Laurent? What are the conclusions of this study? I mean, the subtitle of the Harper's piece is, "Can AI think creatively?" And then, more interestingly, can we? In terms of those questions, what did this experiment teach you?
I oscillated a lot during the experiment, depending on the results we were getting. And I believe that Morten and I are not necessarily exactly drawing the same conclusions.
You're
from
not on the same page,
experiment.
so to speak. Well, he's a professor of psychology.
Yes.
And you are a professor of comparative literature, French, Francophone, and comparative literature. Was that kind of inevitable, or does it just reflect your own quirks, your different conclusions on this?
No, and it's not as if we were in complete disagreement with each other about that. But I try to work with people with whom I do not completely agree, or it would be slightly boring. So it was predictable that we would not exactly arrive to the same conclusions. But I would say that Morten was more impressed by the results we got than I was. What we have in the end is that it's quite difficult for regular readers to make a good determination when they are asked to compare the continuation written by an undergraduate student with the continuation written by GPT. So it's a bit difficult to determine that. But what the process taught me as well is that we have so many. When you do a huge task at generation, as we did for GPT-3, you have so many answers that are just quotes from the authors that you need to discard them. For instance, it makes no point to ask someone if Shakespeare wrote that continuation by GPT if GPT is in fact just reciting the Shakespeare's poem, which GPT is doing quite extensively.
So it's just a mirror. I mean,
it's just a mirror. It's just
we've done shows on AI as a mirror. In fact, someone just wrote a book about it.
So you have to, in order to get interesting results, you have to exclude many texts written by generated by the system, and that, of course, is distorting the results to a large extent.
Well, I mean, you're dodging the question a bit, though. My sense is, Laurent, give me one or two clear conclusions. Should we be really worried about AI undermining our creativity, humanity, or is that a rather
No, on the question
stupid
of
question?
creativity, I don't know if we should be worried or not worried, but there is little to no creation in the systems we have now, in my opinion.
Little, so it's back to Ada. These things can't think for themselves.
But if we define creation as putting two words together that could look like new expressions to someone who would not have read much, then of course they are creative. So we are back to the question of what we call creation. But if we take creation as at the highest level that I would like to, I mean, this sort of transformative innovation that can play with the rules and bypass the rules, that could create exception to the norms from within the norms, it's obvious that none of the systems we have is anywhere close to that.
Laurent, you touch on a deal that OpenAI did with Axel Springer. It's done a number of deals with companies that own creative content. Some are, so to speak, jumping into bed. Some of these creative companies like Axel Springer, the German media company, are jumping into bed with OpenAI. Others are not jumping into bed and taking them to court, like the New York Times. What did your experiment teach us or teach you about all these legal conflicts and commercial deals between companies like OpenAI and media companies? Did it suggest that the Axel Springer route is wiser than the New York Times one?
OpenAI relied on all kinds of material that was copyrighted, so they never completely explain what they were.
They scrape, in other words, to borrow a term, they scraped the internet. They essentially stole the content.
So for the New York Times was pretty much in favor of generative AI until they realized that their content had been just put into the machine. So the change of opinion is also quite related to their realization of that. The business model that and the engineering model that they have, dating back to Turing, in fact, with OpenAI, is that they need to increase the size of the training set. So they need more data, they need more things to put into the system to generate.
So this software is kind of omnivorous. It needs to eat more and more to survive, to live. It's the Frankenstein again, and that was, of course, one of the narratives that came out of Ada Lovelace set in the 19th century.
Yes. And so their problem is that more and more, probably, what you will find freely on the internet will be at least partly generated by GPT or similar systems of that sort. So OpenAI has to, and there are good reasons to believe that the more you train your system with texts that has been generated by the system, then the performance will fall. So they need fresh human flesh, if you wish.
Yeah.
And that's where
maybe it's Dracula rather than Frankenstein.
Yes, it's becoming. We are moving slightly in time, but it's not Polidori. It's also Byron. So it's so we are in.
I mean, Byron could have written this. I don't know whether it be a poem or a novel or a screenplay.
Yeah. It's so they need more fresh blood, and that is where Springer and other companies will just sell those data. So it's these interesting moments where the business plan requires the collaboration of people and new deals.
And what should they do? I mean, you're a lucky fellow, Laurent. You have, I assume, you have tenure at Cornell, so you're not going to lose your job. You can write these sorts of pieces till the cows come home and you still get your money. What about artists who are really worried that their whole business model, their whole being is being undermined? We've had a number of graphic artists, musical artists, writers on the show. Some of them are suing companies like OpenAI. Should we be sympathetic? Should they be worried that this is, to use a rather overused term, an existential event for the creative community?
No, there are two sides. One is that for some artists, their creations have been used without any kind of compensation. So that's, I mean, they would be right to sue in this respect, I guess. The other side is what kind of artists and what kind of thinkers should be extremely worried about the generative capabilities of AI. And many visual artists I know are not bothered at all. I mean, they tend to say that unimaginative art will be done quite well. I mean, it's not really there yet, but will be done quite well by those systems. But the most vibrant artworks will not be generated because they have to be created. And with the systems we have currently, everything is generated that is reshuffled. It's the old data that is being reshuffled in a certain way, not a random way, a sometimes interesting way, but still reshuffle. So if you really believe in the creative power of your art, you shouldn't be so worried about AI.
Yeah, I
However,
mean, maybe it will create more of an appetite, just as vinyl has reinvigorated music and the music buying public. This will
that's what I call
reinvigorate more value in what's at least perceived to be originality in art.
Yes, that's what I call my paradoxical optimism. The only moment of optimism I have vis-a-vis all this right now is that if we are not collectively accepting to ingest more and more mediocre content, the other option is for us to realize that there is something more interesting than just the standard statement or the run-of-the-mill view or the usual kind of art. And so then we could have a general realization that something else should be done and that we should value more this sort of creativity that the systems we have operating with computers are unable to bring us today.
Now you've convinced me, Laurent, you really are a human being, an optimistic French literary theorist.
Okay.
Do you think that these AIs, what would they make of some of your compatriots, the Lacans and the Derridas of the world?
They they could write in the manner of, in the style of. I mean, it's always possible.
Not hard because it's indecipherable often.
That there is no meaning in GPT. GPT is just predicting the next token. So we attribute meaning to the next token. So the task is on us.
Well, finally, and this could have been written by a bot, you end with a note in this excellent piece. It's a fascinating subject, one that isn't going away. You say we're at a pivot point. This word pivot point is overused. It's one you hear continually out here in Silicon Valley. Are we really? Do you really believe that, Laurent? You seem too sophisticated to believe in pivot points.
Unfortunately, I believe in self-fulfilling prophecies. There is such a vast interest, especially on your coast, there is such a vast interest in saying we are at the pivotal moment that we are apparently creating the conditions, socially speaking, to be at a pivotal moment. So people who have not tenure, who do not have tenure, for instance, many people in academia these days would be very happy with the replacement of the humanities with the sort of generated ideas. We have the proposition that, in fact, OpenAI is the most democratic tool, since now you no longer need to know how to write because something else could write on your behalf, which of course is not exactly democratic. So we are right now in the US, maybe not in the world, but right now in the US, there seems to be a very, very vehement push toward the use of AI. What I believe is that if we just lose from sight the rest, what is outside of this tiny window of reality, then by a self-fulfilling prophecy, we will just be at the pivotal moment, going away from from the investment in creation. But as I said, I'm on the side of the paradoxical optimism. I believe that's the choice that we have, that we can contemplate.
Well, we do have and let's end now. It's a fascinating conversation, Laurent. I assume, and this comes back to Turing and Ada Lovelace and everybody else, we still have agency, right? This, whatever happens, we humans have agency, as opposed perhaps to Ada's software that doesn't. What can we do if we care about this? And most people do. Most people want to maintain human quote unquote creativity. What should people do? Pay for their content? Not use OpenAI? Shut their computers down?
Yeah, shut their computers down more often would be not being on social media. In fact, the number one transformation of us into non-agent is the ongoing reprogramming by the conformism that reigns in the way speech is being produced and speech is being exchanged over the internet. So that we should, AI is just a consequence of that. We have accepted collective. I'm not on social media, obviously. I have never been. So these we does not necessarily include me, but it includes all of us to a large extent. We have accepted to be just reprogrammed by our own algorithms, and we should really oppose that quickly. That's the very first thing to do.
Well, Laurent, you've enabled me to shut this thing down. You've suggested we should shut our computers down, so I'm going to shut this interview down. Laurent Dubreuil, the author of Metal Machine Music, a man who really understands the potential, both in utopian, perhaps dystopian terms, certainly optimistic and pessimistic. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the conversation.
And we'll get you back on the show. This subject is not going away.